We have quite a diversified collection of readings from Kings and Chronicles and from the book of Isaiah. So let's talk about how all of these things fit together as we're talking about the history of Israel and God's messages for his people. Okay, let's start by talking about Chronicles and Kings, and then we'll say some things about Isaiah. King Hezekiah in the southern kingdom of Judah is one of the best examples of a good king that the southern kingdom ever had. And so in Chronicles, we read about his reforms and cleaning out the temple and getting Judah back to the worship and the rituals that they were always supposed to be following according to the law of Moses. We read in Kings especially about the trust of Hezekiah when the Assyrians besieged Jerusalem after wiping out the northern kingdom, and how relying on God, Jerusalem is delivered from the Assyrians, and even the story of Hezekiah being sick and praying to God, who extends his life for 15 years, is another sign of the trust that Hezekiah had in God. But the story of Hezekiah is not all good, as Chronicles makes a very interesting statement about how Hezekiah's pride kept him from using the years that God gave him as he should have. The moment of his folly that is highlighted in the king's account is showing the wealth of Jerusalem to the Babylonian envoys, and Isaiah tells him that they will come and take all of that away in a later generation. Chapters 36 to 39 of Isaiah retell many of those same stories that are found in Kings. And the purpose that serves in the book of Isaiah is to transition us from the earlier chapters 1 to 35, which deal with Ahaz and Hezekiah and the Assyrian crisis, calling on God's people to repent and to trust in him, and 36 to 39 shows us how that crisis is resolved and how God delivers his people, and then previews the Babylonian crisis and says that Babylon will come and take these people away and take their treasures away from Jerusalem. And so then in chapter 40 to the end of the book of Isaiah, we are looking not just to the Babylonian exile, but even beyond the Babylonian exile, when God will deliver his people and bring them back to the land after the punishment. And so there are a couple main messages that we will highlight in these chapters. But one of the things that is emphasized over and over again as Isaiah relays these messages from God to a people that will be exiled in captivity is God's power and God being the only God, that he is a God that controls history. He is a God that makes promises and fulfills them. The idols that they are tempted to trust in, the idols that other nations worship, they are nothing. They can do nothing. The nations are a drop in the bucket. So the point is that as all of these things happen, the turmoil of being taken away into captivity, being separated from your homeland, God is the one in control, and his word stands certain. He says what will happen, and it will happen. And so if he promises that he will bring the people back, he's in control. He will, in his sovereign power, fulfill that promise and bring the people back. But the other piece of that is highlighted in these chapters is the special relationship that God has with Israel. Notice how many times he addresses Israel as Jacob, or Israel, the personal name that he says, I have called you, I have redeemed you, I have chosen you. Over and over again, he says, I will be with you, even though they have been unfaithful to him, even though he is going to bring on them a just punishment for their unfaithfulness. Still, he loves them, he has called them, and he is committed to redeeming them and restoring them, bringing them back, not just physically, but bringing them back into relationship with him, forgiving their sins. The return from exile is in view here as God is promising a hope for his people. But ultimately, the real hope for God's people lies not in coming back from Babylon, but lies in the Messiah, the servant that is mentioned for the first time in chapter 42, the one that will come and accomplish God's work of bringing forgiveness and restoration to his people and establishing this great kingdom. So that is the history and the prophecy from this week's Old Testament reading, and I encourage you to check back in next week as we continue through the reading of the Bible in 2020. Thank you.